Edgar Allan Poe. Hands down one of the greatest artists of all time. Not only was his writing poetic, but he dealt with topics in such an extreme and personal way that you almost have to think of him as being one step away from being a psychologist. And on top of all of that, he perfectly embodies this archetype, this narrative of the starving artist. Struggled all of his life trying to create art that mattered, that actually changed the way people thought about things. But more on that in a moment. Hello friends, my name is Michael McCauley. You are listening to Biocast Addendum. In this episode, we're going to be analyzing the life of Edgar Allan Poe. This is just going to be kind of a brief overview of his life story, some of the things that he did, major life events. Now, before we get into the episode though, I strongly encourage you to check out my Amazon documentary. A link to that will be in the show notes or description. You can check it out for free if you have Prime, or you can watch it with ads, whatever floats your boat. But without any further ado, let's find out who Edgar Allan Poe really was. Now, he was born in Boston in 1809, and he has a very strange background. You see, both of his parents were actors. And I'm a strong believer in the idea that your parents really strongly influence the kind of person that you eventually become. I mean, I've noticed just in my own personal life that people end up wanting to follow the careers that their parents pursued, or maybe they pursued at some point in their lives. And the fact that both of his parents were actors kind of gives you some kind of inclination to the kind of person he was going to become. Now, his mom was a really good actress, but his father wasn't. He was just not really good. And his father eventually abandoned the family, and then his mother died. I mean, just so quickly. I mean, I don't think Poe was even 1 year old. And it was just this horrible, terrible tragedy. And he wasn't the only kid. I think there were like 3 of them. So 3 kids, no parents, and whoa, what do you do now? Well, Poe lucked out because he was adopted by a wealthy Virginian family, the Allens. And they changed his middle name to Allan, which is where he gets, Edgar Allan Poe. That's where that Allan comes from. And you see, his adopted father, John Allan, extremely aggressive. And he just disciplined Poe throughout his childhood into his adulthood. And I think it's through this extreme authoritarianism that Poe kind of became anti-establishment, kind of a contrarian. He just really wanted to rebel. And just all throughout his young life and even into his adulthood, you just see this reckless abandon where he just doesn't care about rules or order or anything like that. He's going to do whatever he wants. And I think a lot of that can be attributed to the way John Allan just kind of overbearingly commanded this adopted son. Because I'm sure there was some of that, oh, well, listen, man, I adopted you. I'm doing you a favor. I'm sure there was some of that going on, although we can't really know for sure. But they moved around a couple times. They lived in a London suburb for a couple of years. So he kind of had this British culture coming up. But they eventually returned to Virginia, and when they did in Poe's teenagehood, he fell in love with his best friend's mom. And I could just imagine, could you imagine a 15-year-old being like, listen, man, I know you're my best friend and everything, but I'm in love with your mom. What kind of social dynamic must have been going on between him and his friend, and then him and his friend's mom? What? Poe's friend actually believed that he craved this motherly affection. So, mommy kink confirmed. And well, it wasn't very long before this woman had a mental breakdown and died. We don't really know why she had a mental breakdown. We just kind of know that there was some kind of breakdown toward the end of her life, and then she was dead. And I could just imagine being 15 years old. And this is your life story so far, right? Your parents both, your dad abandons you, your mom dies, you're adopted by rich people, you fall in love with your best friend's mom, and then she has a mental breakdown and dies. I mean, just what a life he's set up for, just at 15 years old now. and he eventually starts a relationship with a local girl, his own age this time, named Sarah. She was a very nice young lady from a well-to-do family, and it eventually turned into a long-distance relationship because John Allan really wanted Poe to go to the University of Virginia. I'm sure there was a lot of that. Listen, you got to go out and make something of yourself, boy. Like, John Allan he just strikes me as being one of those kind of father figures, and Poe was into literature and he was probably very introverted in the house, reading most of the time. I mean, I think outside of dealing with women and, various relationships he had, I don't think he even really had many friends. He was just kind of this loner, and whenever he ventured out of his man cave to write horror stories, he only did so to fulfill this love that he needed from a motherly figure. And while this relationship ended with Sarah, when her father began intercepting the letters, Sarah's father was a little bit more well-to-do, and he kind of thought Poe was lower class or wasn't going to make something of himself one day. And, well, just judging by his character, as you'll see in the next few minutes here, you're going to kind of see why people could have that perception of him. Now, he struggled to become disciplined while in college. He excessively gambled and drank, just like all the time, man. He's always drunk and gambling and partying and going crazy. And he accumulated thousands of dollars in debt from gambling. I mean, it was just, I forget the exact number. It's in the documentary, but it is just such an ungodly amount of money that you're just like, what? At some point, you got to be like, all right, I've lost enough money. Let me stop. And I am sure some of his thought process went kind of like, well, I have an adopted father who's really wealthy, so he'll just pay for all of this money that I am indebted for. And yeah, you could just imagine how Mr. Allan took that news. Yeah, he was completely enraged. And yeah, Poe dropped out within a year. He just couldn't do it. He couldn't bring himself to attend class. By the way, this is John Allan down in this picture over here, but you see the dynamic kind of went like this. So Poe would get drunk, he would gamble, and he would just rack up like thousands and thousands of dollars in debt, in today's currency, of course. And, well, he would just expect Mr. Allan to pay for it. And he did a couple times. He was like, listen, this has got to stop. All right, this is the last time, right? And, well, Poe just never stopped. He just kept gambling with money that he didn't have, that he was expecting Mr. Allan to pay for. At a certain point, he just owed so much money that there was no way he was ever going to be able to pay it back. And Mr. Allan just straight up said, listen, man, if you can't pay this money, you're screwed. That's your problem. I'm done. So he ended up just dropping out, and then he discovered Sarah married someone else. His dreams were crushed. He couldn't go back home now. His adopted father hated him. His little love there completely abandoned him. And the interesting thing too, Sarah's father started taking Poe's letters. So Sarah thought that Poe wasn't writing to her. So she stopped writing to him. But really, it was because of the father's interference. They were still both writing each other for a good long while, but it was because of Sarah's father that they just never got each other's letters. So Poe was completely heartbroken, and just judging by his disposition and the way that he formed relationships with women, you can just imagine how torturous this must have been. I mean, this was a big blow to him, and now he's completely cut off from having this foster family. Sarah's gone. Like, what does he have now? Like, he's just some loser that's in debt. Didn't even finish a year of college. So he said, screw it, YOLO, left for Boston in 1827. And now he's off on his own. And this is kind of the really big jumping off point for his life. Now, he worked various odd jobs for a little while. I think it was a couple months. He was a clerk, a newspaper writer, a couple of odd jobs like that. But it wasn't very long that he realized he was not going to be able to sustain himself for very long. And he enlisted in the military, which was probably the only feasible option he had. You see, the military provides this really great opportunity for really poor people to kind of climb and claw their way into the middle class. And if Poe didn't go into the military, he was either going to be homeless or hope to God that his foster father, Mr. Allan, was going to save him. Like, really, that was it. And considering the way they left things off, he really did not want to have to go back to Mr. Allan. So he enlisted under false pretenses and claimed to be 22 despite being 18 years old. Now, he actually achieved moderate success in the military. And he released his first book while serving, and it was called Tamerlane and Other Poems. Pretty solid couple of poems, some of his older classics. And it received virtually no attention, but it did impress some of his fellow servicemen. Like, there were some people that read it only because they knew him. And they were like, yeah, this is pretty good, not bad. But that was pretty much it. Now, he actually really excelled in his job in the military. He became the highest rank a non-commissioned officer could achieve. Like, that was pretty impressive. He really could have done something or gone somewhere in the military had he just stuck with it. Had he just had the gumption and the humbleness to kind of say, I got to accept where I am and where I can be. He probably could have had a good career in the military, but he was too good for that. He sought to end his 5-year enlistment early, and he believed his potential as a writer would be wasted. And it's kind of hard not to see this as almost a selfish or self-absorbed kind of way of being, a way of responding to the environment, because you see, like, he could have been independent. He could have had a decent small life, and he could have just pursued writing on the side. I mean, that would have been the sane way to do it, right? I mean, let's say you're a YouTuber, right? You don't quit your day job the first day you open up your YouTube channel. Like, it doesn't work like that. Like, have a job, do it on the side, do it up as much as you can, build a reputation, build a brand, get some income, and then go full time. Like, when it's safe. Don't leave your secure job in the military where you've worked really hard and, like, go back to being homeless. I mean, like, I really would like to ask him his thought process that went into making this decision. But you see, what he wanted to do was he wanted to tell the military that he enlisted under false pretenses. And they were like, okay, well, we'll let you out, but you need John Allan's permission in order to get out of the contract. That was the only way he was going to be able to get out. So, of course, he's really trying to patch things up with John Allan, which was understandably tough, right? I mean, they left things on a pretty sour note. And now here comes Poe again asking for more help. Listen, man, I need your help. I need you to write me a letter, please. And yeah, he was really, really reluctant. And it was only after Mr. Allan's wife died that he agreed to give Poe another chance. And this was particularly tragic for Poe because he was really close to Mrs. Allan. Now, she was not a major part of his life, like, for all of the time that she was alive. I mean, they didn't really keep in touch after he had left, but she was this really loving, motherly figure that he just really kind of needed. Because he wasn't getting any love from Mr. Allan and again, all the other women he fell in love with in one way or another, well, they died or they married someone else or, whatever the case may be. So when Mrs. Allan passes away, it was just this horrible, tragic thing. And, well, it ends up being good in the short term because Mr. Allen becomes sympathetic enough now to give Poe another chance. So, it came with an agreement though, and it came with a stipulation. So he was like, all right, young Poe, you want me to get you out of the military? This is what we're gonna do. I'll write you your letter, but you're gonna come back and then you're gonna go to West Point. You're gonna get disciplined. And, well, their relationship didn't really patch up. They just really disagreed. And you see the really hard part about being able to understand these older historical situations. I mean, this is 200 years ago now. It's really difficult to understand the social situations because all we have are a handful of letters and, right, Poe's writings about it, some of the literary figures that he wrote that were supposed to represent Mr. Allen in his stories. Like, that's all we really have. And understanding a social situation when you're not in it, that's hard enough. But to understand it when you can't see the people interact, their body language, when you can't see the way they communicated directly to each other, like, it's just really, really difficult. And trying to piece together what it was like, it's just almost an impossible job to do. Now, their relationship just continued to fall apart, and he went to West Point, but it was like less than a year before he purposely got court-martialed. So I don't know how Mr. Allen treated Poe. I don't know if he pressured him too much, or maybe he didn't put enough pressure on him. Who knows? Poe flunked. This was supposed to be his last big chance. So he comes home, goes to West Point. Less than a year later, purposely gets court-martialed, and that's pretty much it. That is pretty much it. Now, I'm sure there was a lot more that went into their social dynamic. I'm sure they had arguments, and we can get a glimpse of some of that in the letters. Again, some of the only stuff that we have left, but just understanding what led to Poe's thought process in doing this is just really tough. And on the surface level, like, it just kind of comes off as really selfish. I mean, this is a kid who has given multiple chances and chance after chance. And all right, you're got all this debt. All right, we'll pay for this. We'll pay for your education. I'll help you out, get out of the military. I mean, just all of this stuff this guy did for Poe. And he just can't fulfill his end of the bargain, ever. So that was pretty much the end of their relationship. Now, Poe actually reconnected with his biological family that was living up in Baltimore. And this is actually a picture of his cousin, Virginia Clem, down in this bottom corner here. And yeah, she's going to be interesting for a moment. But this is where he really goes through the starving artist phase, because now he can kind of save money by living and shacking up with his family, right? Just mooching off of other people. Not to say that any of them were really productive or anything. I mean, they were all alcoholics, or like they had their own mental problems themselves. I think his brother Henry died of alcoholism and mental insanity, like all this horrible stuff. So Poe fit right in, and he just desperately pursued writing as a career. That was his goal. That was his number one goal in life. Everything else fell completely flat. Nothing else mattered. Becoming a writer, only thing that mattered to him. And he accepted humiliating wages for his works. Now, this was a point in American history that it was really tough to become a writer because there were weird copyright laws, and people just didn't value writing enough that they were going to buy your book. Or, I mean, even today, it's really difficult to make it as a writer. It always has been. Always has been. And Poe gets it in his mind that he's going to become a writer by any means necessary, even if that means accepting some pretty humiliating wages for his works. So this was a particularly difficult time to make it as a writer in American history. People didn't really value writing enough to pay a whole lot of money for this or that. And not to mention, you don't have the internet, so everything that can be sold has to be like printed. Just think about how difficult it is to really make a career out of doing that. It's just really tough. And he especially struggled because there was a lack of international copyright laws. So what a lot of these American businessmen would do is they would take writing from over in the other parts of the English-speaking world, primarily from Great Britain, and they would take those writings, and then they'd just bring them on over here and sell them over here, because guess what? There's no copyright laws protecting that work for British citizens, so oh well. And it's really tough to get American readers to pay for American works when they can pay so much less for a work that was a British person's original work, right? So it's just this really tough situation that it made becoming a writer so insanely difficult. And he increasingly turned to alcohol as a coping mechanism. And as is often the case, it just doesn't make the problems fundamentally go away. So he gets fired from various prolific writing jobs for drinking on the job. And it's really sad too, because despite how difficult it was to make it as a writer, I mean, there were points like he was like the editor of certain literary magazines, and he held a couple of really solid positions, and he really did make a name for himself. But you see, the problem was that no matter how much success he ever had, no matter what job or what magazine he was working at or what award he ever got, it just didn't matter. Like, he was going to go home, he was going to drink. I mean, sometimes he would come into work drunk. I mean, that's just the kind of guy he was. And a lot of his coworkers and friends actually wrote about him becoming insane. Literally insane while he was intoxicated. And I can just imagine. Now, around this time, he gets married to his 13-year-old cousin, Virginia Clem. He was 26 years old. And this was in 1835. So you just have to imagine being a wannabe writer who goes from job to job, drinking all the time, drunk most of the time. You're 26 years old and you marry your, not just a 13-year-old, but your 13-year-old cousin. Oh my God, what is wrong with you? I know it was a little bit more common back then. Doesn't make it any less weird. Moving on. Gets really sad really fast, because Virginia contracts tuberculosis in 1842. And I almost theorize that the reason that Poe went for Virginia Clem is because he didn't want to date an older woman. I mean, he dated his friend's mom when he was younger, right? So he was like, all right, I don't want to date an older woman because older women are going to die before I do. So if I date the youngest woman I can, she'll hopefully live long enough for me to be happy. And, well, so much for that idea. But, yeah, when he wasn't drinking on the job, he harshly criticized other writers. And he made a lot of enemies. I mean, if you personally knew Edgar Allan Poe in the flesh, you probably didn't like him. Like, we can all look back on his writings and his various works. We can all kind of admire that. But if you personally knew him, you probably wouldn't have liked him. He took no responsibility. He was a drunk. He was just this crazy, insane weirdo. And if he read your work, he probably said that you sucked. He was not afraid to tell you that your writing was horrible. You should put down the pen and you should, right? Just go home and just never write again, right? So, in 1845, he published The Raven. The infamous Raven. Actually, not infamous, very famous. It was an instant success, which made Edgar Allan Poe a household name. Like, overnight, he became a celebrity. And this is basically the 1800s version of going viral. So, he publishes The Raven. He becomes a household name overnight. And how much money does he earn? Is he a millionaire? Is he rich and famous and wealthy and got everything in the world? He receives $9. $9. The story that literally turned him into a household name. Still famous to this day. He only got paid $9 for its publication. Now, don't get me wrong, that is $9 in 1845. Probably a decent chunk of, maybe a few $100 today, but even with inflation taken into account, the Raven was worth a lot more than $9. And it's just really tragic to see how, despite being such a great writer, such a great thinker, pouring so much of his life and soul into writing, didn't get anything in return. Again, though, that could really go back to burning bridges with everyone in the writing world. Could be. And, well, the high is very short-lived because Virginia dies just 2 years later. 1847, Virginia dies, and I can just imagine how horrible this was for Poe. Because now there's a real pattern here. His mother dies. The first love of his life, his best friend's mom, dies. Sarah marries someone else. His foster mother dies. And then you have Virginia, who passes away, and she's like not even an adult. She's like this teenage girl that Poe married. And now she's dead too. He has nothing. He has nothing at this point. A lot of his biographers and even fans of his really believe that he had this morbid obsession with stories about death and women because all of the women he ever loved died, right? And you almost have to wonder, right? Could that be the case? I mean, as everyone knows, right? Artists write what they know, and maybe that's just what he knew. Maybe the reason that he was always writing these morbid, dark, horrible stories with death and women and suffering and misery, maybe that's the only world he lived in. We really have to wonder. Now, he reconnected with his childhood sweetheart, Sarah. Remember Sarah from back then? Yeah, he reaches out to her. Turns out that she was a widow, and they start a relationship. So things seem to be okay. Now, we don't know a whole lot about this point in his life because that period between Virginia dying and hooking up with Sarah, we don't really know too much. He was probably a complete wreck of a human being during that time. And I don't see his bounce back to being with Sarah as some kind of shallow, narcissistic, oh yeah, let me just be with another woman. I see it more as a complete act of desperation. All the suffering that he had been through. He's just desperate. He's like, well, anyone that'll take me. Yeah, pretty much how it was. And I almost want to say that Edgar Allan Poe had a tragic death. But I think given the way his life played out, his relationships, the way things went, I don't think it's tragic. I think it's fitting. Now, he died in 1849 after being found completely delirious. He was likely the victim of cooping, which was basically where American politicians and their goonies, they would kidnap people, beat them up, make them drink alcohol, make them take drugs, and then they would get them to go in and vote for them. So a lot of very gangsta politicians back then, that's kind of how they got elected, a good chunk of them. And some of the reasons that people think this is because, well, he did get drunk all the time, but it was very rare that he was found, completely delirious and out of his mind on the streets. Plus, he was wearing clothes that weren't his. There were just a lot of fishy circumstances. So the whole cooping idea, most likely theory, that's the one I subscribe to. There are others. I'm not trying to start some controversy, but I just want to let you know there are others. Rufus Wilmot Griswold. That was Edgar Allan Poe's arch nemesis. Professional opponents, right? Whenever one of them published something, the other one would be the first one to criticize it. If there was ever an opportunity to take the other one down a peg, right? They'd hop on that opportunity. Now, most people draw the line when your opponent dies, right? Not Rufus Wilmot Griswold. So just listen to this, right? He wrote this horribly cruel obituary claiming that basically no one was going to miss Poe. No one's gonna miss you. Yep, he's dead, but no one cares. Then he steals the copyright to Poe's literary works by lying to his family. He shows up at his family's doorstep, says, listen, I was Poe's best buddy, and he wanted me to act as his literary executor, so yeah, I'm going to need the copyright to all of his works, and, well, they don't know anything, so they give him the copyright to all of his works. And then, what gets even worse, he publishes this stuff, makes money from it, and then doesn't share any of the profit with any of Poe's living relatives. So, and which, if he had not stolen the copyright to Poe's literary works, that family would have been entitled to getting that money. But it was stolen. And Griswold was reaping the rewards. So not only does he hate Poe, not only does he write this horrible obituary, but he steals his works and then takes the money from it and doesn't give it to any of his family. Oh, but it gets worse. So he publishes a biography of Poe, which greatly exaggerates the truth. Right? There's a lot of truth to Edgar Allan Poe's mental illnesses and his drinking problems, but he just writes this horribly, insanely exaggerated story of basically a drunken madman. Basically a drunken madman. Kind of the way a lot of people even still think about Poe. And he even included fake letters that he claimed were written by Poe, but he actually wrote them himself, which is just so incredibly dishonest that you just have to really sit back and say, oh my God, you had real hatred for this man. I mean, what did Poe ever do to you that you're willing to do all of this stuff? I mean, just look at this list. I mean, writing an obituary saying no one's going to miss him, stealing the copyright to his work, profiteering from stolen work, and then writing basically a hit piece biography. And then not just writing a hit piece biography, but writing fake letters in the biography. That is next level cruelty. I mean, that is just, honestly, that's evil. Straight up evil. And then he attempted to destroy Poe's reputation, but you see, this kind of backfired, you see, because it ended up making Poe one of the most famous writers of all time, like in history. I mean, think about how many writers that we remember from this period, right? Edgar Allan Poe, hands down, one of the most famous writers, not just of this period either, but of all time. Of all time. And I think a lot of that is attributed to Griswold's hit piece, his reputation attack, this smear campaign, if you will. And it's just kind of the ultimate irony because no one knows who Griswold is anymore. No one knows about him. No one cares about him. No one reads his works. But everyone's talking about Edgar Allan Poe. And I think that's the ultimate irony, maybe the ultimate justice of it all. Because you have to look back and wonder, had Griswold not done all of this horrible stuff, Poe probably would have been another nobody that everyone forgot about. Like, there's a good chance. I'm really not a big fan of speculating on, historical what-ifs, but I think you can say with some certainty, had Griswold not gone out of his way to do all of this stuff, because again, he may have been profiting from publishing Poe's works, but he's publishing them, right? He's getting Poe's works out to more people, right? And it's just kind of crazy. Kind of crazy. And then it gets even worse. I know you might not believe it, but it gets even worse. Now, when Griswold dies, about 8 years later, in the room that he died in, there is a portrait of Edgar Allan Poe, and it's found on the wall facing Griswold's deathbed. This is 8 years later. Just think about the insanity. Think about the level of obsession. I mean, that is an unhealthy amount of hatred and obsession. Now, I don't know if this was like he really hated Edgar Allan Poe and he just wanted to look at a picture of him every day and hate him. But I mean, he was sick for quite a while. He was bedridden, so you have to imagine a good chunk of his time was just spent looking at a picture of his archenemy. even on his deathbed. And I don't think you could have found a better way to end the life of Edgar Allan Poe. So thank you so much for listening all the way through. Be sure to check out that Amazon documentary. We go into a lot more depth in there, have a lot of great animations and visuals and everything like that. Thank you so much for watching all the way through. This has been Michael McCauley from Biocast Addendum, and I will see you on the next one. Peace out.